I had just graduated from university and was drowning in student debt, so I decided to move in with my older brother, Max, until I could afford a place of my own. The last time I'd seen him was 5 years ago at his wedding. He had married this awful woman named Naomi, and I knew then that she was a gold digger. However, I was too afraid to say anything. After the wedding, Max cut off all contact with me and the rest of our family, all thanks to Naomi. I didn't hear from him again until after they divorced, but even then he wasn't the same. It was like his spirit was broken. Honestly, I was surprised that he agreed to let me move in. I hoped that living together would help us reconnect, but I was wrong. After staying with him for a month, I had only seen him maybe 4 or 5 times. He spent all day and night working in his office. We were living in the same house, but it was like he was a complete stranger. We didn't even eat together. Then, one night I was in the kitchen when he came downstairs and said that he had to run some errands. I thought that was really strange because it was 11 at night. I tried to ask him where he was going, but he said he didn't have time to explain. He reminded me once more to stay out of his office, and then he ran out of the house. The next morning, I noticed that his car wasn't in the driveway. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I could hear his phone ringing from inside his office, meaning that he'd left it behind. I knew I wasn't supposed to go in there, but I didn't have a choice. I was worried about him. So I opened the office door, surprised that he left it unlocked. All the lights were off, but his computer screen was still glowing. He had kept his browser open, and it was clear that he had gotten into some weird dark web stuff. I saw some sort of web page, mostly black, with a couple of dozen tiny logos of different weapons, everything from ropes to explosives. 4 of the weapons were highlighted chains, a baseball bat with nails sticking out, 2 different knives, and a blowtorch. Those were the ones he'd selected. At the bottom of the screen was an address and a price minus 600 bitcoins. I took a photo on my phone and then ran to my car. If my brother was mixed up in something illegal, I had to stop him. Armed with some mace, I drove to the address, which was an old warehouse just outside town. The place looked completely abandoned, except for Max's car parked behind some dumpsters. I instantly regretted not calling the police. This was not a safe place. But it was too late now. I had to go inside and see for myself. I crawled through a gap in the chain link fence and found a side entrance that was unlocked. Very quietly, I snuck inside. The inside of the warehouse was divided into several dark rooms, each filled with old factory equipment and metal cages. It was very quiet, except for a soft clinking of chains from somewhere in the back. I followed that sound until I made it to a metal door. I gathered up my courage and stepped inside. Right away, I saw a woman chained to the floor. Half of her face was horribly burned, but I could still recognize her. It was Naomi, Max's ex-wife. She was so out of it that she didn't notice me at first. In front of her was a table covered with the weapons that Max had ordered on his computer: the knives, the baseball bat, and the blowtorch. I was so disgusted by what I saw that I was frozen in place. Suddenly, Naomi's chains banged against the ground. She had seen me. She reached forward, silently begging me for help, and I saw that 2 of her fingers looked broken. What had Max done to her? I scooped up the key on the table and ran to Naomi. I had to free her. I crouched down and asked her what was going on. She tried to answer, but I couldn't really understand. Still, I didn't need an explanation to know that Max had spent all night torturing her. With her fingerless hand, she gestured toward a door to the side. I assumed that Max was in there. I had to get her free before he came back. My hands shaking, I unlocked her chains and helped her stand up. She mumbled something at me that sounded a bit like hurry as I guided her toward the exit. I heard the door open behind us. Max was wearing a welder's mask over his face. He ran toward us. I wanted to think that he wouldn't attack his own sister, but after what he'd done to Naomi, I didn't know what he was capable of. He was running at full speed. Without thinking, I grabbed the baseball bat on the table and swung it into his stomach. The nails dug into him, and he instantly crumpled to the ground. Had I killed my own brother? I felt terrible, but when I pulled off the mask, I saw that it wasn't Max at all. It was a total stranger, obviously the hitman that Max had hired online. But then, where was Max? Naomi kept gesturing toward the side room, so I stepped over the body and peered inside. There was Max, asleep on the couch, smiling. I guess he just wanted to stay here while the hitman tortured his ex-wife. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but Naomi touched my shoulder. Go, she tried to say. She looked at me, her one good eye pleading. That's when I made an awful choice. Okay, I said, and I left her there. As I walked out of the warehouse, I looked over my shoulder and saw Naomi grab the blowtorch. When I was outside, I called the police, and as I waited for them to come, I could hear a man screaming through the walls. I've always loved my neighborhood. It's quiet and friendly, the kind of place where you can leave your doors unlocked without worrying about anything. I've lived in these suburbs pretty much my whole life. They've always been cute, quaint, and exactly what people expect when they envision Midtown America. We don't all know each other's names or anything. This isn't Mayberry, but we did all have a good understanding of the community and how things flowed. Crime was at a minimum, at least from what I recall. But as we know, those kinds of things can always change. During the COVID-19 pandemic, that's when it happened for us. Strange faces started appearing, and I noticed people who didn't quite fit in. This was definitely happening all over the US. People were flooding out of cities by the hundreds, if not thousands, and overflowed into the little outskirt communities and suburbs, thinking they would be more lax with protocols and procedures. And whereas they were right, that was only because we had a limited population. Once an extra 10,000 people rolled into town, filled up the hotels, and started sleeping in their cars on the streets, things changed, and we had the same laws and restrictions as those big cities. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the weeks went by, I realized that something was off. It wasn't anything major, but it definitely found its way onto my radar. I was working from home at the time, and with less to do, I found myself keeping an eye on the neighborhood. And that's when I saw this beat-up old car with rusted wheel wells and shrouded windows. It just looked like trouble. It was parked in front of the Johnson house, where high school-age kids lived. I thought maybe it belonged to a visiting friend, but something about it just made me uneasy. This was the thing that had me feeling off, as I'd never seen such a questionable car inside our neighborhood. I kept an eye on it, but didn't see anyone or anything. "Hey, hun, come check this out," I called to my wife, nodding towards the window. She came over and peered out onto the street. What am I looking at? That car. Doesn't it just look off to you? She frowned. "Maybe it's just a friend visiting the kids over there," she asked, pointing to the Johnson house. Yeah, maybe you're right," I said, dismissing it. "I just came to this weird conclusion, it looks off." We agreed that it was out of place, but there was nothing else really to do, not unless we wanted to call the police. And I wasn't that invested. It just felt definitely overboard in the moment, crossing a line, so to speak. It's probably nothing anyway, but we made a note to keep an eye on the street and see if it left. It did, sporadically coming and going at random intervals, all without us ever seeing the driver. It was mysterious but not the end of the world, so I ended up just forgetting about it. It was probably just COVID paranoia clouding up my brain. Fast forward a week, I noticed the police were now patrolling the neighborhood. That was unusual. We never saw cops around here, unless it was for a speeding ticket or a lost cat. I didn't put two and two together at first, just figured it was a random patrol, or maybe they were looking for some troublemaking kids. It wouldn't be the first time a group of high schoolers would tear through backyards to get away from whatever nonsense they had orchestrated. They would scream, laugh, and laugh some more as they ran through hedges, fences, or down paths through the woods. But then I saw the car again, and something about it just didn't sit right. I know cars age, but the condition of this car was just dreadful, like it had been through some horrific event. It was unsettling to see it in our peaceful neighborhood. Then, one night, as I was closing up the house, I noticed that same car parked right across the street from our house. And this time I saw someone sitting inside. That was enough for me. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was afraid that I was being paranoid, but when the officer showed up and saw the car, his face immediately hardened. He knocked on the window, but there was no response. The windows were too tinted to see inside clearly. After a minute, he stepped back and called for backup. 2 more police cars showed up, and the officers surrounded the vehicle. They ordered the person inside to step out, but still, nothing happened. Finally, one of the officers used a tool to break the driver's side window, and the door creaked open. Inside, slumped over the wheel, was a man who looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. His clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a half-empty bottle of something, probably liquor, next to him. But what was really horrifying was the smell that wafted out of the car. It was the stench of death. The officer who opened the door immediately stepped back, gagging. I was still watching from my window, and even I could smell it. It turns out the man had been living in his car for weeks, surviving on whatever he could find, but he wasn't alone. In the back seat, under a blanket, was a body. It was so decomposed that they couldn't tell who it was or how long it had been there. The man was immediately taken into custody, but I heard later that he wasn't in his right mind. He kept talking about how he had to keep the body safe, how it was his responsibility. They never released the details to the public, but I had my theories. The next day the car was gone, but I could still see the stains on the pavement where it had been parked. I couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful neighborhood I had loved so much would never be the same. A few years ago, I got a job as a night janitor at an office building downtown. It was a pretty easy gig: clean some floors, empty the trash, and make sure everything was locked up tight before leaving. The place was usually deserted by the time I arrived, so it was just me and my earbuds, playing music as I worked. It was nice to have the place to myself, and I got used to the quiet, empty hallways. However, one night, I found something that made me reconsider taking that job in the first place. It was around midnight, and I was mopping the floor on the 4th floor. I was almost done when I heard a noise from down the hall. It was faint at first, but as I stood still, it became louder, a sort of scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I turned off my music and listened closely. The building was supposed to be empty, so who could be making that noise? The sound was coming from one of the offices at the end of the hall, the one that was always locked whenever I came by. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to check it out. As I approached, the noise stopped suddenly. I reached for the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing the door open. Inside, the office was pitch dark, but I could make out the shape of a large desk and some chairs. There was nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that the room felt much colder than the rest of the building. I reached for the light switch, but as soon as I flipped it, The lights flickered once and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I heard the sound again, the scraping noise, but this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart was racing, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I decided that whatever was in there, I didn't want to know. I finished my work as quickly as possible and got out of the building. The next day, I mentioned the incident to one of the security guards. He just laughed and told me that the office belonged to a lawyer who had been working late one night a few years ago. Apparently, the guy had a heart attack and died right there at his desk. They didn't find his body until the next morning. Since then, people have reported strange things happening in that office, lights flickering, cold spots, and even the sound of something being dragged across the floor. The guard told me not to worry about it, that it was just a ghost story, but I wasn't so sure. After that night, I never worked the 4th floor alone again.